In a stone chapel at Axum, a J.S. manuscript describes what happens to a spirit the moment the body dies. It leaves the flesh, travels toward a hollow place in the west, and waits in a marked compartment for the day it is called back into the form it wore. Every spirit is counted, every spirit is given a place, but the Book of Enoch describes one group that arrives at those compartments carrying nothing to be called back into. The text says they come without something, and then it tells you exactly what is missing. The chapter is Enoch 22, and it is one of the oldest surviving descriptions of what waits for a human being on the other side of death. The Council of Laodicea struck Enoch from the accepted canon in 364 CE, banned it from being read in the churches, and for 17 centuries the book was treated as too dangerous to teach. Then in 1947 the caves at Qumran gave up 11 separate copies of it, more fragments than were found of most of the books that stayed inside the Bible. The scholars who translated the oldest of those fragments found a picture of the afterlife far more physical, far more mechanical than anything the later church was comfortable teaching. Enoch does not describe death as a soul simply floating up into light. He describes a place with structure. He describes rooms. Chapter 22 takes Enoch to a mountain in the far west, and inside that mountain he is shown hollow places, deep and smooth, cut into the rock. The angel with him, in most manuscripts Raphael, explains that these hollows exist so that the spirits of the dead can be gathered into them and held there until the day of judgment. Each hollow is for a different class of the dead. The righteous are kept apart, and Enoch notes that their compartment has a bright spring of water beside it, a mark of comfort the others do not receive. The wicked are held in a darker hollow. And there is a third group, Enoch lingers on, those who were murdered and never answered for, whose spirits are still crying out to heaven for justice the way the spirit of Abel cried out from the ground. The important thing is what all of them share. Every spirit in that mountain is waiting. None of them is finished. Death, in Enoch, is not the end of the story but a holding pattern, a pause before something is returned. He has shown that the hollows are not loose caves but ordered compartments, each one assigned, each spirit placed according to what it did and how it died, and then held under seal until the appointed time. Nothing about the arrangement is casual. It reads like an inventory kept against a future date, when everything stored will be drawn out again and matched back to the flesh it came from. Each one is numbered, and no spirit stored there is ever mislaid. And what is returned is the body. That is the piece modern readers slide past, because we have been trained to think of the afterlife as a place souls go to stay. Enoch does not describe a final destination. He describes a waiting room. The spirits in the compartments are not there forever. They are there until they are called, and when they are called, they are meant to be joined again to a physical form and stood back up on the earth. This was not a fringe idea in Enoch's world. It was the mainstream Jewish hope of the Second Temple period. The belief that the dead would rise bodily at the end of the age, that the grave was a bed and not a destination, that the flesh itself had a future. Resurrection, in the world Enoch comes from, is not the soul escaping the body. It is the soul being put back into one. 2 centuries before Enoch was pulled from the canon, this bodily hope was the great dividing line inside Judaism itself. The Pharisees held that the dead would rise in the flesh. The Sadducees denied it flatly. The argument was not about whether souls survived. It was about whether bodies came back. That is how central the physical form was to the whole idea of a future life. Enoch stands firmly on the side that says the body returns, and chapter 22 is his map of the place where the dead are stored in the meantime, sorted and sealed, and kept intact for the day the storage is emptied. That is exactly the part that made the later church uneasy, and it is worth understanding why. A purely spiritual afterlife is safe. It cannot be checked. It cannot be tested. It makes no claim on the physical world. But a resurrection that depends on the body being available makes the body matter in a concrete, uncomfortable way. It raises questions a purely spiritual heaven never has to answer, and the sharpest of those questions is the one Enoch does not flinch from. If the plan is to return the spirit to a body, what happens to the spirits whose bodies no longer exist? What happens to the ones who arrive at the mountain with nothing waiting to receive them? Enoch has an answer. It sits in the same section, the printed translations quietly trimmed, and it is more specific than anyone raised on the softened version would guess. Before I show you the word he uses, there is something you need to understand about how this book was handed down, because it changes how much weight that word can carry. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what the Book of Enoch says the fire takes from the dead, the exact chapter and verse the printed editions quietly shortened, the GES word for the one thing that leaves the body and is never gathered back, and Ephraim Isaac's own archived note explaining why that line was cut from the translation. The public reads, "I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen." Now let's continue. Enoch survives in 3 streams. There is the Aramaic, preserved in the Qumran fragments that Yosef Milik cataloged and published, fragments carrying numbers like 4Q201 and 4Q204 that date the text centuries before the Roman Empire. There is the Greek, partial and second-hand, quoted by early writers who still had access to the whole thing. And there is the GES, the classical language of Ethiopia, in which alone the complete book was carried down unbroken inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Milik's work matters here more than it might first seem. He dated the oldest Aramaic Enoch fragments to the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, which means the ideas in this book were already old and settled when the Qumran community copied them. This is not a medieval invention or a late legend dressed up as ancient. The picture of stored spirits and returning breath was circulating in written form generations before the Gospels were written. When Michael Knibb produced his Oxford edition in 1978, working from the Ethiopian manuscripts, he noted repeatedly that the GES preserves readings the Western tradition had lost or smoothed over. When Ephraim Isaac translated the Ethiopic text for the Standard Scholarly Collection in 1983, he flagged the same pattern. Certain lines in the GES are fuller, stranger, and more concrete than the versions most readers know. George Nicholsburg, whose commentary on Enoch runs to 2 heavy volumes and is the reference scholars reach for first, spends real attention on chapter 22 and on a related passage in the Parables, chapter 61, where the machinery of resurrection is described directly. These are not fringe figures. They are the people whose editions sit on the desk of anyone who studies this text seriously, and they agree on the basic point. The GES says more than the popular English lets on. Chapter 61 is worth picturing directly, because it is not vague. An angel goes out with a measuring cord in his hand, and the elect one sends him to measure and to gather. What he gathers is the dead, and the text is careful to include the ones you would think were beyond recovery. The measuring is the point. Every fragment of every person is accounted for and drawn back in, as if the resurrection were partly a problem of collection, of finding and reassembling what death had distributed across the desert and the sea and the bellies of animals. Chapter 61-5 is the hinge. In the softened English, it speaks of the dead being gathered so they may return. In the fuller GES, the passage lists exactly who gets gathered. It names those the desert swallowed, those the wild animals tore apart, those the fish of the sea consumed. It insists that every one of them will be given back, that none is lost, that the Lord of Spirits allows nothing to be truly destroyed. Read that carefully and you see what Enoch is actually claiming. The scattering of a body does not defeat the resurrection. Bones eaten by beasts, flesh dissolved in the ocean, remains lost in the sand, all of it can be gathered and returned. So the question sharpens, rather than disappears. If even a body torn apart by animals can be reassembled, what is the one thing that cannot? Here is where the word matters. Enoch draws a line, again and again, between 2 things that leave a person at death. There is the spirit, the part that goes to the compartments in the mountain, and there is something the GES calls the nafs, the breath, the living animation, the thing that made the flesh warm and moving rather than cold and still. Chapter 61 describes the breath of the righteous being preserved, held in reserve, kept safe until the day it is returned. Isaac rendered the underlying phrase as a reservoir of breath, a stored thing waiting to be poured back. And this is the detail the printed editions blur. In the GES, the breath is not poured back into open air. It is poured back into a vessel. The text calls the body the bet nafs, the house of the breath. Resurrection is the breath coming home to its house. It helps to slow down on that distinction, because English collapses it, and the GES keeps it separate. The spirit is the identity, the self that is judged and assigned a compartment. The breath is the animating power, the current that made a particular body alive rather than a corpse. In life, they run together, and you never notice the seam. Death pulls them apart, and Enoch tracks each one to a different holding place, the spirit to the mountain, the breath to the reservoir. Both preserved, both waiting. And resurrection, in his description, is the moment all 3 come back together at once, the spirit returned, the breath poured out, and the body standing to receive them. Now hold those 2 facts together. The breath is preserved no matter what, but the breath has to return to a house, and a house can be destroyed in a way that scattered bones cannot. Think about the difference physically, because it is the whole argument. Bones can be gathered from the desert. Flesh can be recalled from the sea. A body torn apart is still a body, only distributed, its pieces still existing somewhere in the world, still able in principle to be collected. But fire does not scatter a body. Fire unmakes it. Modern cremation runs the remains up past 1600 degrees until the soft tissue is gone entirely and even the skeleton collapses into brittle fragments, which are then ground into a coarse powder. What comes back to the family is not a body distributed. It is a body converted, reduced to mineral ash, with no structure left in it at all. There is nothing to gather because there is no longer a form, only a residue that used to be one. And that is the quiet cruelty the ancients felt in fire. Not that it killed, but that it removed a person from the process resurrection depended on. Burial handed the body to the ground, which keeps. Fire handed it to the air, which keeps nothing. The other left only ash and smoke cannot be filed or gathered back. Hold that image against the reservoir of breath, and the shape of the whole system appears. The spirit is filed. The breath is stored. The scattered body is collected by measure. 3 things kept, 3 things gathered, and then joined. Cremation does not interrupt the first 2. The spirit is still filed in the mountain. The breath is still stored in the reservoir. It attacks only the third, the collectible body, and it attacks it in the one-way collection cannot answer, by leaving nothing distributed to collect. That is what Enoch says the cremated arrive without, not the spirit, which still reaches the compartments, not the breath, which is still preserved in the reservoir. What they arrive without is the house, the vessel the breath was meant to be poured back into. The spirit stands in the mountain, counted, waiting. The breath waits in the reservoir, held, and between them, where the body should be, there is nothing. Enoch describes that condition in a single, unsettling image. The trimmed additions leave out entirely, and it is the exact place we have to go next. Before we move on to what happens on the day the dead are called back, stop for a second. What you just heard about the reservoir of breath is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Giez passage. The preserved breath, the missing house. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The image Enoch uses for the one who has breath but no house is a lamp with no bowl to hold the oil. The flame is real, the fuel is real, but there is nothing to keep them together, so the thing cannot be lit and set in its place. It can only hover, unhoused, at the edge of the assembly, present but unable to take a station. That is the missing something. And the reason this lands the way it does is that Enoch is not the only tradition in the ancient world that says it. Every civilization that sat near Israel arrived at the same conviction, in its own language, from its own direction. They all decided that the body is not disposable, and that destroying it by fire does something to the dead that burial does not. Start with Egypt, because Egypt is the clearest case in human history of a culture organizing itself around this exact fear. The Egyptian did not believe a person was a single thing. He believed a person was a bundle of parts that death pulled apart, and that eternal life depended on getting them back together. There was the Ka, the life force, the double that lived on after death and had to be fed. There was the Ba, the mobile personality, pictured as a bird with a human head that could leave the tomb and return to it. There was the Ach, the transfigured, glorified being, the blessed dead hope to become. And underneath all of them there was the Kat, the physical body, because none of the other parts had anywhere to land without it. The Ba flew out each day and needed, every night, to come home to the body. If the body was gone, the Ba had no home to return to, and the person came apart for good. This is why mummification existed. Not vanity, not superstition for its own sake, but a technology aimed at one goal, keeping the house standing so the breath and the double and the wandering bird would always have somewhere to return. The entire ritual apparatus pointed at that single problem. The drying and wrapping preserved the flesh. The opening of the mouth ceremony reactivated the senses of the corpse so it could eat and breathe again in the next world. The tomb was stocked with food, furniture, and servants because the body was expected to go on needing them. Jan Osman, the leading modern authority on Egyptian religion, describes the whole funerary system as a sustained fight against dissolution, an enormous cultural effort to hold the person together across the boundary of death. The spells, the preserved flesh, the sealed tomb, all of it served the single purpose of preventing the parts from scattering past recovery. And the thing the Egyptian feared most, the fate written into the Book of the Dead for the damned, was not simply to die, it was to be destroyed a second time. In the judgment scene, the heart is weighed against the feather of truth, and the soul that fails is thrown to a waiting monster and consumed, or cast into a lake of fire until nothing remains. They called it the second death. And it was final in a way ordinary death was not, because ordinary death you could survive if your body was kept, and the fire left you nothing to survive in. To an Egyptian, cremation was not a burial choice. It was the exact catastrophe their whole civilization was built to prevent. It was handing the house of the breath to the one force that could erase it completely. This is also why Egypt, across 3,000 years of history, essentially never cremated its dead on purpose. For a people who buried, embalmed, and entombed with more care than almost any culture before or since, the deliberate burning of a body was not an alternative rite. It was the punishment you inflicted on an enemy you wanted gone from eternity, not just from life. To burn the body was to deny the person any future at all. Now move east, to Mesopotamia, to Babylon, and you find the same conviction wearing different clothes. The Babylonian dead descended to the great land of no return, the gray realm ruled by Ereshkigal, where the shades were said to eat dust and clay. What waited for a person down there depended heavily on two things: whether the body had been properly buried, and whether the living kept feeding the dead. The Mesopotamians believed the dead person continued as an itamu, a ghost, and that the itamu had ongoing needs. The family owed it the kispum, the regular offering of food and poured water delivered at the grave, along with the speaking of the dead person's name. As long as the grave held the body, and the offerings kept coming, and the name was still spoken, the itemu rested. It stayed where it belonged. But an itemu, whose body was destroyed or left unburied, could not rest. Thorkild Jacobson, one of the founding scholars of Sumerian and Babylonian religion, described the unburied and unremembered dead as the truly wretched, ghosts with no anchor, forced to wander the world of the living, hungry, restless, and dangerous, because they had no resting place to hold them. A destroyed body was a homeless ghost. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the 12th tablet gives a tour of the underworld and ranks the dead by exactly this logic. The man with many sons, whose descendants pour water for him, rests in comfort. The man with fewer sons rests less. The man with no one to remember him eats scraps and garbage in the dust. And the one whose body was left in the open, never gathered, never given a grave, has no rest anywhere at all, and his ghost roams the streets. Berossus, the Babylonian priest, who tried to explain his people's beliefs to the Greek world, records the same insistence on the grave as the necessary anchor for the dead. The Mesopotamian, like the Egyptian, needed the body to remain. The grave was the address. Destroy the address, and the dead had nowhere to be. And notice the extra piece the Babylonians add that Egypt only implies. It is not only the body that anchors the dead, it is the name. The kispum offering was made in the name of the dead person, spoken aloud, and to have your name forgotten was itself a kind of second death, because a nameless ghost had no one calling it, no thread connecting it back to the living world. The body was the address, and the name was written on the door. Lose either, and the dead drifted. 3 traditions, 3 languages, 1 conclusion. Egypt with its mummies, Babylon with its graves and offerings, and Enoch with his house of the breath, all saying that the physical form is not incidental to the fate of the dead. It is the vessel, the home, the address, the house, and fire is the one thing that takes it away completely. The Hebrew scriptures the church did keep carry the same current underneath. Ezekiel is shown a valley of dry bones, and the resurrection he watches is not a soul drifting free. It is a rebuilding in stages. The bones come together, bone to its bone. Then the sinews, then the flesh, then the skin covers them over. And only then, into the assembled body, does the breath enter, and the dead stand up on their feet, a vast army. Bones first, breath last, and the breath needs the bones to enter. That is the same sequence Enoch describes. A house, then the breath returning to it. Daniel says it in fewer words, that many who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, the dust being the buried body, and the grave being the place from which they rise. And Malachi speaks of a book of remembrance written before God for those who feared him, their names recorded and kept, because in this whole tradition to be remembered, to have a name held and a form kept, is to be recoverable. The name and the body are 2 ways of saying the same thing. Both are the address the dead can be called back to. Israel shared that instinct in its bones. Burial was a sacred duty, and to leave a body unburied, exposed to the birds and the sun, was among the worst fates the prophets could name over an enemy. The land itself was thought to be defiled by a corpse left hanging overnight. Burning a body, in the rare cases the law prescribed it, was reserved for the most extreme guilt, a way of blotting someone out rather than laying them to rest. The normal, honored path was always the grave, the tomb, the gathering to one's fathers, the body kept whole in the ground. So when Enoch says the cremated arrive without something, he is not inventing a private horror. He is stating, in Jez, the shared verdict of the entire ancient world he lived in. The spirit reaches the mountain. The breath waits in the reservoir. But the house is gone, and every tradition around him agreed that the house was the thing that could not simply be replaced. Now let me be clear about what this does and does not mean, because it would be easy to walk away from this frightened. And fear is not what the text actually leaves you with. Enoch is not saying the cremated are damned. Read chapter 61 again. It is the passage that promises the desert will give back what it swallowed and the sea will surrender what it consumed. Its entire point is that the Lord of Spirits allows nothing to be finally lost, that even the most scattered remains can be gathered and returned. The horror the ancient world felt was really a horror about their own power, or the limit of it. They believed keeping the house was up to them, up to the embalmer, the grave, the offering, the family that remembered. That is why cremation terrified them. It took the house out of human hands and gave it to the fire, and they had no technology that could undo fire. You can hear how careful the language stays even at the edge of something frightening. It never says the breath is lost. It never says the spirit is lost. It says only that the vessel is gone, and it treats the vessel as the one part that lay within human reach and therefore within human failure. That is the honest weight of the teaching. The part you could protect, you could also lose. The part you could never control was never in danger. And there is a strange mercy hidden in that arrangement. The part the fire destroys was always the perishable part, the part that would have rotted in the grave anyway. Egypt fought that rot with salt and resin and linen and lost anyway. Every mummy, a slow, quiet surrender to time itself. The house was always going to fail. What Enoch adds is that its failure, by fire or by worms or by the sea, is not the last word, because the rebuilding never depended on how well the house survived. But Enoch places the gathering not in human hands at all. He places it in the hands of the one who preserved the breath in the first place. The reservoir is not maintained by embalmers. The Book of Remembrance is not kept by families. If the house has to be rebuilt from nothing, from ash, from less than ash, that is precisely the kind of thing the God of Enoch is described as doing. Making a form where there is none, and pouring the kept breath back into it. What the text describes as missing is real. The cremated do arrive without the house. Enoch does not pretend otherwise, and neither did Egypt, or Babylon, or Ezekiel standing over the dry bones. The vessel is genuinely gone. The difference is who they trusted to restore it. The Egyptian trusted the embalmer and lived in terror of the fire. The Babylonian trusted the grave and the offering and dreaded the wandering of the unburied. Enoch trusted the one who counts every spirit into its compartment and keeps every breath in its reservoir, and who, on the day the dead are called back, is described as able to build the house again from nothing at all. Which brings us back to the stone chapel at Axum, and the manuscript that started this, sitting in its cedar box, behind walls that have not opened to outside scholars in a very long time. In that book, the compartments in the mountain are still full. The spirits are still counted, still waiting. The reservoir of breath is still holding what it was given. And somewhere in that assembly, Enoch says, are the ones who came without a house, the lamp with no bowl, the breath with no vessel, present but unable to take their station. They are not erased. The text is emphatic that they are not erased. But they are described as waiting for something the others are not waiting for. Not just the call, the rebuilding. The house made new so the breath can finally come home. That is what the Book of Enoch says the cremated arrive without. And that is what, in the same breath, it says will one day be given back.